Okay, let's get started. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, and thank you to Dr. Nichols for joining us. This will be our final meeting for this semester, uh, and we are just going to have a few things we want to get out of the way at the beginning. So let's get started. So today's meeting agenda, we're going to talk about our policy plans for the next semester. Then we're going to get into the presentation, and then we'll have audience questions. So anybody who has questions during the presentation, just type it in the chat like usual. So next winter and spring, we're just going to have the usual general body meetings and town halls. But in addition to that, we're working with Wayne State's Government Affairs Office to meet with lawmakers and talk about science policy with them face-to-face virtually. But this will allow us to actually get to the root of science policy and get started on what we really want to get done. So you have that to look forward to next semester. If you are looking for any potential volunteer opportunities, just email us at Science Policy Network Detroit. We are going to be working with Cures to distribute tablets to 65 and older people to help with literacy with technology. So if you're interested in something like that, just shoot us an email at scipoldetroit@wayne.edu. So we have a take-home activity, Shreya. Yeah.
So for our take-home activity at our last event, our Detroit Water Panel, we told you guys that we would create an assignment of sorts for you to do in order to kind of be active within the issue of the Detroit water shutoff. So we have really quick letters and pledges for you to fill out that we're going to be sending through an email. And with the letter, all you have to do is write your name and email address, and it'll automatically generate your local state and state senators and representatives. And then you just copy and paste the message that we created for you and press submit. So it's super, super quick, but it's really effective. I actually sent my letter today and I got a response from my local senator, and it wasn't like a generated response, it was like an actual response about the issue I sent. So that was really cool, and it's kind of encouraging and telling that, hey, we can actually make a difference through these letters and through activism. So make sure you guys keep an eye out for that, and please, please, please make sure you fill those out. It literally will only take 2 minutes, I swear. So thank you so much. I'll pass it back to Sora.
And if anybody is looking for something to do over break, you are itching to write something that, if you really just want to write a blog post for the website, email us at scipoldetroit@wayne.edu also, and we'll work with you to get that published on the website. It could be about anything related to science policy. Just write to us. About 400 words, 400, 500 words is kind of what we're looking for. So just take a look at the website also, see what's up there. You can sort of get an idea of what we're looking for. And because communication is so key and things like that, we're going to move over to our speaker today, Dr. Thomas Nichols. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm sorry, I missed that last part.
I said, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Oh, great. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. And it's great to be with you. I'm sorry it has to be virtual. Wish I were with all of you right now. I'm Tom Nichols. I teach at the Naval War College, but important to add that I don't represent the U.S. government or any of its agencies. And I'm here, I think, to talk about communication and expertise because I wrote a book called The Death of Expertise. And so I thought what I would do, since I know we are all just fascinated by endless Zoom meetings and people talking at us through cameras, is that I would just spend a few minutes going through the main arguments about what I wrote and why I'm so concerned, and then open it up to discussion, which I think probably be more interesting for most of us, to do it that way. So the first question I always get is why I would write something with such an obnoxious title, because we know that expertise isn't dead. I mean, we're all sitting here. There are plenty of experts right here in this meeting. We all use expertise every day. We know that experts are alive and well. So what am I so concerned about? Well, what pushed me, what triggered me to write this book was not that experts are dying off, but that we are suffering through a period, and I think it began a long time ago, where the idea of expertise is failing, where trust in expertise is failing. Now, again, I think you could look at a comment like that and say, well, but people have never, I mean, especially you're sitting here in a university environment, right? People have never liked eggheads. Nobody likes professors. You know, you just live with that. There's a story I tell, and this is the book itself, but there's a story I tell right in the beginning of this thing where I say, my brother, God rest his soul, my late brother owned a bar when I was a young professor. And it is great to have a brother who owns a bar, let me just tell you. And I was there, I was hanging out with him one night, and then I had to go back up I was teaching at Dartmouth in those days, so I had to drive back up from Massachusetts. My brother told me later, he said, a guy was sitting at the bar overhearing us, and he turned to my brother and he said, so your brother's a college professor, huh? And my brother said, yeah. And the guy said, well, he seems like a good guy anyway. Like, you know, the assumption was, oh, if he's a college professor, by definition, he's probably a jerk. I hate to say that that's normal, but it's normal. What's not normal is the new phenomenon, and I say new, maybe over the past 20 or 30 years, of people saying, not only do I not trust experts, I am smarter than experts. I will explain to experts what they don't understand. And what pushed me to write this piece, because the book actually came out of a magazine piece I wrote about 7 years ago, was a student or a younger person, possibly a grad student. This was somebody who was interacting with me over social media, and 20-something, who said, now my background is in Russian affairs. Like, I started studying Russian stuff 37 years ago, went to the Soviet Union, I speak Russian, I've spent a living there a couple dozen times, I've negotiated with Russians in official settings, I mean, I've done all this stuff. And this younger fellow didn't like what I was saying about Edward Snowden and Russia, and finally he said, Tom, I don't think you understand any of this. Let me explain Russia to you. And I said, I said, no, there will no, this conversation is not going to turn into you in Russia to me. So that sat down and I said, on the planet, how did this happen? Because what I found was, when I told that stories like that to other experts in various fields, they say, oh yeah, that happens all the time. You're a doctor, like now going through the COVID pandemic, you're a doctor, let me explain viruses to you. But it happens as well. And I want to make this point, because I do not believe the word expertise simply refers to people with advanced degrees. I had a house fire here. This is my home in Rhode Island. I had a house fire here, and the guys that were working on my house, first of all, my expertise in nuclear weapons and Russian foreign policy was completely useless. They were moving me out. They were like, yes, Dr. Nichols, let us move you out of the way of this chimney that's about to fall on your head. Yes, you're a very smart guy. Now get out of the way before something hurts you. But all of these guys that were working on my house said, oh yeah, we get that all the time, because we got talking, because I actually try to live by my own words here. So, you know, when the electrician said, well, we're going to put a GFPWB, and I just went, I said, Jim, words, electricity, right? And he said, yes. And I said, you know what you're doing. You're a master electrician. I believe you. And we got talking about this, and they all said, the carpenter, the painter, the electrician, the plumber, they all said people kind of hover over them and say, you know what you ought to be doing there? And you ought to do. So I decided to look into this more and to ask why this is happening, because I think even before the pandemic, I was concerned that this was really dangerous to our health and to our well-being, but I also think it is a danger to our democracy. Democracy cannot function in a nation of know-it-alls. We are, as you know, conservative senators like Mike Lee like to point out, we are a republic, not a democracy. And on this, he has a point. We are a republic of delegated powers. We appoint and vote for other people to make decisions for us because we're not Switzerland. We can't all gather once a year and approve the budget. And if we decide that we're all stand around in the public square with megaphones yelling at each other about how, you know, we all understand the National Defense Authorization Act, when in fact we don't, then democracy just falls apart. So let me, I only brought a few slides to kind of illustrate the other point I wanted to raise, which is the people who think that I am worrying too much. Because sometimes people say, you know, it's never been better than this, and you know, you're just worrying a lot. Let me suggest a couple of things about what happens when people don't know things, which is normal, but when they also have very strong opinions about things. I don't know how many of you watch, like when Jimmy Kimmel does this and he walks down the street and he asks people their opinions about completely nonsensical things, and people say, yes, I have yeah, absolutely. You know, no one ever just says, I don't know. So here's a couple of examples that I found particularly worrisome. This is a map of Europe. Now, I am a former 5-time undefeated Jeopardy champion from the 90s. So this is a great Jeopardy question. What is the largest country in Europe whose borders are entirely within Europe? And the answer is Ukraine. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, the Washington Post did a poll, and there were a lot of people who had some pretty strong views, including the idea of putting U.S. troops on the Russian border in Ukraine. Now, you know, we political scientists call that World War III, a highly dangerous idea. The problem was that the people with the strongest views, and there's Ukraine right there, you could throw a dart at Europe and have about a 1 in 3 shot at hitting it. The people with the strongest views on using force in Ukraine were also the people who were least likely to know where it was. The average respondent was off 1,800 miles. Now, I don't expect you to be able to pass a map test in Europe. On the other hand, when you are on the wrong continent and yet expressing your very strong view that perhaps we ought to send troops there, that should give all of us pause about what we're dealing with. Here's a map. Now, as you can see, this goes all the way from the Persian Gulf all the way out to the middle of the Pacific, out near Hawaii, down to Australia. See all those little blue dots? Each of those dots is the guess of an American adult about where North Korea is. Now, you know, as they say on Twitter, let that sink in for a moment. Only about 32% of Americans were able to put it up here on the Korean Peninsula. My favorite part of this map is that there were a lot of people who figured out that North Korea was in Korea, but they put it on the southern tip of Korea anyway, even though north, you know, would be right in the, you know, name of the country. But that doesn't really explain the other 2/3 of Americans who think that North Korea is in Sri Lanka or in Indonesia or in Australia or Japan or My favorite are the little blue dots in the middle of nowhere in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. This is a country that has developed a nuclear capable ICBM in the past 5 years. But what about other threats? Well, a polling firm asked Americans if we ought to bomb Agrabah. And there were some very strong positions on that, pro and con. Republicans tended to be in favor of bombing Agrabah. Democrats had very strong feelings about not bombing Agrabah and leaving the peaceful Agraban people alone. Agrabah is, of course, the fictional country in the movie Aladdin. So roughly half of Americans had really strong views on whether or not to bomb a cartoon. So how did this happen? And I'll just leave this up for a moment and then I'll speak to these points. I think the underlying problem, in the book, I identify three basic problems here, which is the way we do higher education, the proliferation of media outlets, and of course the internet. But I actually left the internet for last because I think this problem predates the internet. I think underlying all of this is the of social malady, a real epidemic that began in the early 1970s, and that epidemic is narcissism. We have become a remarkably narcissistic culture and society, and that is true even throughout the developed world. And I think that is the result of affluence, technological advancement, peace. But it is definitely creating a culture in developed societies where people feel they know more than they do, where their choices are always affirmed, where they do not tolerate being told they're wrong very well. When it comes to higher education, for example, I think, and I would apply this to K through 12, but I didn't write about it because I'm not an expert, so I could only go by what K through 12 teachers were telling me. But at the college level, and I'm feel bad saying this to smiling college students who are waiting to hear the next thing I'm going to say, but that we have engaged in a therapeutic model of education, that we spend an inordinate amount of time asking college students, are you happy? Did you enjoy this? Was it fulfilling? Do you feel included? Do you feel affirmed? College is supposed to be uncomfortable. Now, I loved college, and I should also say this is not me with sour grapes about I've been teaching for 35 years. I've had a very successful career. I love teaching, but we do spend a lot of time trying to engage student happiness rather than student learning, in particular because we have been driven so hard toward the tyranny of metrics about so many things. And that's true in doctors' offices as well. I mean, doctors, good example of the death of expertise problems. When I interviewed doctors, said people don't come in anymore and say, I want a second opinion, or, no, you're not going to cut me open and take my liver out, or whatever it is. They walk in and they say, here's what I have and here's what you're going to do. Here is the procedure I am hiring you for, in this very transactional way. And one of the doctors, when we got talking about the opioid epidemic, he said, look, when the patient walks out and they are asked on a scale of 1 to 7 how happy they are with the service they got, the younger doctors, this was a very old doctor who was about to retire, he said the younger doctors have a big incentive to simply say, give people the prescriptions they want and make them happy so that they are not fired from their practice as, struggling young doctors. And so there is that issue resonates throughout American society of keep the customer happy. But, I think you could probably make a good argument that this is also a capitalism problem of marketizing everything. And I'm a big fan of capitalism, but I am not a fan of turning everything into a market, oriented toward consumers. The great inflation, student evaluations, all that, that's all, I talk about all that in the book, but I think in the end, we still have a problem with increasingly treating students as if they are clients. I actually worked with a colleague who, because we teach graduate level education to military officers. That's my day job. At night, I teach undergraduates at Harvard Extension, and I teach courses other places. I've taught at Dartmouth and Georgetown and LaSalle and a few other undergraduate institutions. But with our graduate students, this colleague said, well, they're not students, they're clients. And I said, no. And one of my colleagues said, if they are as capable as we are, they can teach the course. And this turned into a big food fight. In the book, I really go after the teachers who say, well, I learn as much from my students as they learn from me. To which my answer is, then you're ripping them off, because it's not an equal exchange. No teacher should say that. This is the kind of thing you can get away with saying when you're old, because this is now a standard interview question for a lot of young professors. But it says something dysfunctional, and the reason I think it's dysfunctional is not because I think students should just walk in and venerate the old professors and burn incense and offer chickens and sacrifices to us, but rather because it creates students who are resistant to learning things because they think they already know enough to engage as peers. And I'll just tell a quick story. I'll move off of education with a quick story. I had a political, I had to work my way through college. I don't come from an educated family. I had to work my way through school, work my way through my first year, couple of years of graduate school. And then I got a fellowship to Georgetown. And I thought I was just the coolest kid in the world for getting a fellowship to Georgetown. And I had this Jesuit, this steely-eyed Jesuit professor, crew cut, black man, the original Man in Black, the whole thing. And he was one of the greatest teachers I ever had. But I thought I was very smart for having a scholarship and arguing with him in class. And he had to, cut me back down to size regularly. And at the Christmas party for the department, I'd got an A in his class. And I walked up to him and I said, well, Father, what do you say? I said, Merry Christmas. What do you say? Peace on earth, goodwill toward men? And he looked at me over his glasses and he said, what I say to you, Mr. Nichols, is repent. And I suddenly realized that, we're not peers. I mean, we're not there yet. And as it turns out, Father Jim, who died recently, broke my heart. We became friends and peers and colleagues over the course of the next 25 years. But at that moment, it was the greatest service he could have done me to, I'm not Catholic, by the way, but nonetheless, he chilled me right to my soul. He just kind of looked over his glasses and he said, repent. And I think that was a healthy experience. This was a professor who handed out an essay at the beginning of every year that said what a student owes a teacher, which I could not imagine a professor trying to hand out in class today. All right, aside from education, we have an obvious problem with media and bandwidth, where now we can graze the media outlets so that we never have to encounter facts that we don't like. We have a much more diverse media ecosystem. I don't think it was a better world when I was a boy, where it was 3 old white guys reading curated info streams from New York. The news when I was a boy was 28 minutes long. The only advantage to that is that if you were going to watch the news, you had to watch the news and you actually had to pay attention to it. Today, if you ask an American, do you feel informed? Do you watch the news? They say, oh yeah, I watch the news. What they mean is they had Anderson Cooper on as video wallpaper behind them. They say, oh sure, I watch the news. No, that's how you think you watch the news, and then you think that North Korea is in Sri Lanka. The other thing that happens is that people flip the channels. Now, I've been on all the networks. You can say that I am part of this gladiatorial, too many talking heads on the screen problem. But people, when confronted with views they don't like, will flip the channel. I was, in my youth, a Reagan conservative. I have since become, a unpartied anti-Trump activist. But I watch all of the networks just to enforce a certain amount of discipline on myself to know what other Americans are watching. I mean, I make myself sit through, the other night, I sat through an hour of Sean Hannity, which was like, tinfoil for an hour, but I did it because I need to know what other people are watching. We don't do that anymore. We say, if we hear someone I like, we flip and we say, I am informed. Smart people agree with me. I am never wrong. And again, it's the media marketized as a for-profit activity, convincing us that we don't need alternative viewpoints. And finally, there is the problem of the internet, which takes all of this narcissism, all of this siloing, all of these educational problems, and it puts them on steroids. I started to notice a decline in the quality of papers I was getting from students in direct proportion to internet citations, for example. And it's just the way it is. I started noticing that people were developing stronger views on social media simply by writing them down, which we know psychologically is a real thing. When you write something down, you believe it more. But the internet is not the original sin of our problems. This narcissistic attachment to our own sense of rightness is the source of our problems. And we can overcome that, but it's going to take effort. It's going to take a lot of self-examination by Americans of every political stripe. And I think, as well as in places like Europe and the developed nations, this is happening as well. Britain, India, Poland, Hungary, these are all places where there have been measurable increases in narcissism and polarization. And so how does all this come back to your problem of communicating with people? These are the people you're trying to communicate with. These are people who have now a hardened shell of resistance, whether they are students or ordinary citizens or colleagues across a divide in another discipline who are completely resistant to learning new things or accepting that their beliefs do not cover all possible situations. And I think just having a situational awareness about the nature of this problem makes you better armed to deal with it. But I'm not sure that I have good solutions, because when I was on the road talking about this book, people would say, what's going to solve this? And I would say a war, a depression, or a pandemic. That's usually what snaps people out of these things. And instead, the pandemic, in part because we are a highly successful technological society that is already solving this problem, actually has made it worse. People are upset that we don't have a vaccine yet, when vaccines normally take 3 to 4 years. And you try to explain this to people and they're like, what? How hard can this be? That's part of the problem with a technologically advanced society, that the answer to everything is, well, how hard can any of this be? It also leads to populism in politics, because it leads a lot of people to say, well, I could be a senator. How hard can that be? I could be president. I could run a city. How hard can any of this be? I read some stuff on the internet. I can send email. And it has really led us into a dead end about expertise in policymaking, where people simply think that if you're not solving problems, because you're not trying. It's one of my friends coined this. One of my colleagues coined this when it comes to presidents as the Green Lantern theory of the presidency. Green Lantern with his ring, where he just concentrates hard enough and he can create a giant wall or a hammer or whatever. One of my political science colleagues calls this the Green Lantern theory of the presidency, that any president who just concentrates hard enough can solve everything, like he's wearing a magic green ring. All right, let me stop there and get to your questions, because I think it could probably be more interesting for everybody else. I could go on with these examples all day long, but better to have a discussion, I think. So let me stop there.
I guess I can start, and I have so many things to ask, and I know a lot of us do, but I think everything you mentioned to us is what what's been kind of percolating in our minds, and that's why we decided to create this organization, because a lot of us are seeing these problems. We're scientists or we're students of science, and we're seeing that there's this huge public mistrust of science and misunderstanding of science. So I know you said you don't have the solution to this, but if you could think of one thing that we can do, as scientists or students of science to help kind of bring that back together, I guess, what would be your advice for us?
That's a great question. And my advice is counterintuitive, because I'm looking at the chat here as well, and Max Denny asked the question about responding with charity. That is the problem to me, is that experts and scientists and people with professional backgrounds in a subject area have been for too long too charitable, because that leads to affirming some of these terrible habits in the public. And the example I always use is, as teachers, we're always taught that no matter how crazy the question, that you begin by saying, well, that's a good question, and let's explore that together. The problem is when someone starts by saying, you know, professor, I take what, like I teach courses on the Cold War. I take what you're saying about, the Cold War and space, the space race, but I don't think we ever landed on the moon. I'm sorry, but the right answer to that as an expert, and to kind of start rolling this back, is not to say, you think the Apollo missions were faked. Okay, that's a good question. Let's unpack that together. No, I think, and I said this to a meeting of one of the working groups at the National Academy of Sciences, plant the flag in the ground and say, look, not having that conversation. That's attention-seeking behavior. And I think that dovetails into the narcissism problem of, I just think the world's flat because I know you'll talk to me for 3 hours about why it isn't. Now, I think part of that, the expert's duty here, is always to remember that our client is society itself. That's why we claim a certain amount of privilege as experts and demand to be listened to as authoritative compared to other folks. So, we do have to try to weed out that group of people from people who are genuinely scared or confused. But I think that increasingly this kind of negative challenge to expertise needs to get a flag planted in the ground to say, you're asking my expert opinion? It's not an opinion. It's a fact. We landed on the moon. Do you have a question about that? Because I'm not having a discussion about the other thing. My response to the National Academy of Sciences guy, someone said, well, you don't want to be condescending. I said, that's right, but you also don't want to be patronizing. Because I actually think my experience with most people is that if you are confident in your discussion of the area in which you have expertise, people actually are more respectful of that than this sense they might have that you're trying to kind of string them along or jolly them up or play along or treat them like children. And I think that model of discussion has gone on too long. Now, with that said, it's interesting as well that someone just sent me a study, and it's one study from the university, a bunch of guys at the University of Waterloo in business and communications. They found that inducing feelings of ignorance in people actually made them more receptive to listening to real information. Now, that does not mean humiliating them, but it means walking them through to the point where they understand what they don't know. To say, look, that's just not right here, because there are other studies that suggest a backfire effect, that when people are shown they're wrong, they actually double down because they're so upset about it. I'm not sure which of these is a more effective approach, except that I think that the charitable, understanding, warm, empathetic approach has not been working. And I think, experts claim authoritative knowledge. If you're going to claim authoritative knowledge, then you need to be authoritative, because otherwise you are playing into well, you don't really know anything more than anybody else does. And I'll give you an example of this. When doctors, about eggs, I talk about this is another example from the book. Remember when eggs were evil and then they were okay again, right? Like we weren't, and some of you younger kids, sorry, but for like 30 years, don't eat eggs. They're full of cholesterol. They're going to kill you. They're poison. They're like just, and then a study came out, finally, meta study after meta study said, we can't even metabolize the cholesterol in eggs. They're just healthy little protein pills that you could eat all day long. They're fine. I went to my own doctor and I said, Doc, dude, and he kind of hung his head and he went, yeah, we screwed that one up. It's okay. it's okay to say I don't know. It's okay to say we screwed it up. But when I brought this up in a lecture, someone said to me afterwards, well, that just proves doctors don't know anything about heart disease. I think that just reaffirms that all along doctors have never known. And I said, whoa, 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 whoa. I said, you're going to believe that right up until the moment you have chest pains. I said, this is where a doctor has to say, oh, I know a lot more than you about chest pains. And I included this in the book. When I got to Dartmouth as a young professor, there was a legendary story they told about a guy named Robert Jastrow, who was an astrophysicist. And a student apparently was arguing with him about something. And after they argued back and forth enough, the student said, well, your guess is as good as mine. And Jastrow said, no, 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 no. My guesses are much, much better than yours. And I think that's an okay thing to say. And I think, to say, I understand you don't want to do the appeal to authority with yourself as authority and to say, I am an expert, I have spoken. But we have to intervene in this vicious cycle of, well, you have an opinion, I have an opinion, we all have an opinion. No, I think we need to do some tough love. That's my answer about that. What to do in colleges and universities? I don't know, because I'm waiting for another event to happen first, which is that the education bubble is about to pop. So I think colleges and universities, some of this will solve itself when the educational debt bubble finally collapses, for the same reason the housing bubble finally collapsed, which was people making bad choices about spending too much on things that weren't worth the money. With that said, I wish, I think one thing that is, and the students can't really, this is transparent to most of you, but I think my colleagues will understand this. The move toward more and more adjuncts at the mercy of student evaluations is a really bad part of this, because it puts young faculty, I am actually in one of the few institutions that is ditching its contract system and has adopted a tenure system, which is the complete reverse. And it took us, 15 or 20 years of trying to convince the government that, that the contract system was producing timid faculty that were not, really capable of going toe to toe with senior military officers. And I am pleased to say that I'm probably the only institution I can think of that has gone toward a tenure model and ditched the contract model. But that, if I were the president of a university, that would be the first thing I would do, is start getting rid of the exploitative adjunct professor model and start empowering the faculty to be able to, hand out an essay that says what a student knows a teacher, like my professor did 35 years ago, because I think we have to restore some kind of balance in the classroom dynamic. I don't think it helps anybody to have, a professor standing there saying, I don't know if I'm going to be here next year, and if I don't perform with appropriate entertainment, I could be fired. I think that's a real problem. And I fought against it in my own institution. And I really thought I fired my first shots about this at my own institution almost 20 years ago. I thought I'd lost that battle. A group of younger faculty during a reformist period took it up. So we actually have instituted a tenure system where one didn't exist. And I couldn't be prouder of that. But I don't think I think most college administrators would like turn off their Zoom camera hearing me say that right now. You sent me a thing of other questions, but go ahead, Shreya, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine. I was just wondering, I don't know if you know anything about this, but like when it comes to social media, since that's what everyone's using these days, like face-to-face conversations are definitely lacking when it comes to expressing ideas or sharing values. So I'm just wondering, like, what's your take on maybe using social media instead of a weapon, like more as a positive kind of thing? Like, do you have any advice for something like that?
Well, it's hard for me to give you well-meaning advice because I am part of that problem. I have almost 500,000 Twitter followers, and I'm kind of a jerk on social media sometimes. No, you're not supposed to nod when I say that, by the way.
That's okay. She's a
I'm
jerk.
kind of a jerk on social media, and Brianna's going,
Yeah, no, I am too. That's why I agree with you.
I actually try now in my defense, when people engage with me in good faith in areas where I have something to say, I actually will try and answer questions. I mean, I don't care if you're like, a new account with 2 followers. If you ask me a good faith question, I try and answer the mail, because I think that's I'm a teacher by profession and by spirit, and I try to do that. I also think, though, to be a public intellectual, which is really for professors on Twitter, you are not being professors, you are being public intellectuals. You have to be able and willing to have a thick enough skin to slap people down. Um, you know, I mean, it is because the problem with social media is it encourages this hostile narcissism, because you don't have to look other people in the face. You don't have to see them look hurt or appalled. We take so many of our cues about how to be normal people by just looking at other human beings and seeing their, kind of, see if they smile or if they're giving us the eyeball. I am really glad that I did not go on to Twitter or have a significant social media presence until I was 51 years old, because by that point I was already a fully socialized human being. And so I always know, I mean, when I turn, people say to me, how do you take all this hostility? Because I've, because of my political activity and because of things I've said, I've gotten death threats. People have tried to get me fired. I'm for 5 years, like, every few months there's an effort to, people write letters to get me fired and all that stuff. And because I understand that there is a world that when I shut off Twitter, I always tell people, my wife loves me, my daughter loves me, my cat loves me, and the rest of you can go to hell. But that's a healthy approach to say, no, I'm not. We derive so much of our sense of ourselves now from likes and retweets and clicks, that I'm not sure what's going to break that. I once Politico magazine once asked for a kind of series of solutions about how to fix politics. And I actually think we would be a better country, and it's impossible to do this. But youngsters, back when I was your age, you actually had to pay for for internet access. It was not all you can eat. So if you wanted to go hang around in a chat room or watch videos, you actually had to pay by the hour. It was metered. And I think that just like all you can eat buffets make people fat and diabetic, all you can eat internet buffets are making people stupid and hostile. So I wish there was a way that we could just impose a market cost solution to say, if you want to sit around on YouTube and watch Q videos all day long, that'll cost you $3 an hour. And I think you would see a lot of this behavior just drop right off the face of the earth, because people would just have to stop doing it because they don't need it. It'd be like taxing sugar. People would just eat less sugar. I'm all about, I'm a free market guy, but I'm all about sin taxes and vice taxes. I know they're regressive, but life isn't fair sometimes. We're not going to be able to do that. So I think part of what's going to happen with social media, to go back to your question, is the worst abusers of social media in terms of people who see things and believe dumb stuff are people my age, in their late 50s and 60s, who are retired and have time, and they are not Twitter users. Twitter skews young and liberal. Facebook skews old and crazy. And so, that problem is going to solve itself in about 20 years, maybe sooner. That a lot of those users are just going to die. And I don't know what you can do in the meantime, because for a lot of people, that is their only connection and sense of affirmation with anything. It is ironic. I'm working on a chapter I have a new book coming out in the summer, and I'm working on the chapter now where it's how ironic it is that we are more connected than ever before, and yet lonelier and more isolated than we've ever been, especially teenagers and college students.
Yeah, I wanted to go back kind of to Max's comment because I think your response was really surprising to me, and I actually really appreciate it. And especially for something like what you were talking about when you opened, was that you had plumbers at your house and you said, you know, I have my area of expertise, this is your area of expertise. I think that's a good example for all of us to kind of be, you know, examples. Like, I study neuroscience, I'm going to kind of stay in my lane, but if it's in my lane, you know, I'm confident in saying what is actually established versus not. And it is a weird situation because when you go through scientific training, like you mentioned, you know, you learn what you don't know. And we talked earlier with Abdul Al-Sayed, who talked about the Dunning-Kruger effect, and that, you know, the people who know the least are sometimes the loudest, and then the people who actually understand the science and what the scientific process looks like are actually the quietest, because we kind of know all the nuance. So I really appreciate that response. I wanted to give Margaret the opportunity to ask her question because she actually had kind of the opposite problem where, you know, Dr. Nichols, you have a doctorate, so what can you tell me about, you know, XYZ topic? So Margaret, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, so I think one thing I find with myself is, although I do know that I'm not a real expertise in any area as I'm still a student, but I have areas where I have more knowledge than others. And still in conversation, I do find myself uh, assuming that I know more than the other person, and I wonder how to combat that with myself and recognize when is the best time to really just like pull back, especially when you're talking to someone else who also isn't an expert.
Why are you trying to combat that? Why not ask yourself, well, is this a place where I probably know more than this person? Why are you going immediately to the assumption that I should pull back on that? I mean, unless you're both unless you're a neuroscientist and she's a lawyer and you're talking about how to make cookies, and then you might want to talk to a chef. But I don't, I think I think it's amazing the amount of time we spend trying to restrain ourselves so that we don't appear to be socially combative. And I think other people in these expertise problem discussions count on that. They count on it. They count on you not to be socially combative so that you will say, okay, maybe you're right. I don't know. I'm sorry, Margaret, you were going to say something. Why? I saw
Um,
you let up.
I guess I haven't really thought about why I am thinking about this so much. Um, I guess because if I'm going to, I think if I'm going to criticize other people for questioning experts, then I need to make sure that I am not doing the same thing.
Okay.
I guess that's where I'm coming from.
And this goes back to Hillary's question about, I mean, I'm a big fan of the Socratic method with this, right? Where if someone says to me, well, I don't think you're an expert on Russia, or I think, I have some thoughts on nuclear weapons or on national politics. And people say, well, how does Russia translate? You write articles about, the Senate. And I'm like, well, I worked in the Senate. I mean, I have a life experience. I had a life before you opened up USA Today and saw my column. Things happened to me before the day you discovered me. And so I will say to people like that, well, where did you get your information? How is it, when someone says, well, masks don't work. And I said, where did you hear that? Where are you getting your information? And boy, you can already see them going, uh-oh, I didn't count it. And this goes back to Margaret's question. They were counting on you saying, well, maybe they don't. When you say, how do you know that? Where did you find, they suddenly say, oh, I didn't want to have to explain that. And now they start backing up. And they say, well, I read things. I've had this conversation a million times on various things. Well, I read things. I'd like to read them too. Where did you read that? Well, it's something I saw. Okay, well, when you can figure out, because what I've seen tells me something different, and I haven't seen the thing you've seen, and I'm not sure I buy that, but I'd like to see it. And what you realize is when people say, well, I've read things, they say, I formed an opinion, and then I surfed around on the internet until I found a website that made me feel better about having that opinion, and now I'm throwing it at you as authoritative. The other thing I think you can do with people who do that is to say, you're in, Margaret, what's your field? What are you studying your
I'm in
doctorate?
the medical school at Wayne.
Okay. turn to people and say, what is it? What is it? What do you do for a living? Oh, well, I'm an accountant. And do you have any background in this? How did you come to these, well, and you can, just by asking these questions, they will start back. I had a guy call me, I talked about him in the book. A guy called me one day, he said, I've written a thing on the Middle East that I think you should use in the curriculum at the Naval War College. And I said, okay. I called because a student of mine had asked me to talk to the guy that he knew. This is like we always say here in New England. The Rhode Island state motto is "I know a guy." So I ended up taking the call because I knew a guy, and so anyway. And he says, "Yeah, it's about the Muslim Brotherhood basically taking over the Pentagon and the U.S. government." I said, "Okay." And I said, what is your background? How did you come to write this? Instead of just saying, look, I'm an expert on international relations. I have a PhD. I'm chairman of the department. Click. I said, what do you do for a living? So I'm a financial planner. I said, really? I said, do you have any background in this subject? Do you read Arabic? Is that how you? No. I said, well, what? He said, well, he said, I read a book a month. Hey, you read a book a month. You're an expert, right? And I said, wrong. That is not how you become an expert. I said, on what basis did you write? I said, was it reviewed by anyone? Have you submitted it anywhere? No, it's just something I've been working on. And I said, well, you understand that I can't. I said, that doesn't pass the standards of what I would normally include in the curriculum. And I'm giving you the chance here to tell me why I should do this. And basically he ended up having to say, well, I just think I'm right. And I don't like Muslims. And I wrote this piece. I was not going to play the game of, well, it could be an interesting viewpoint. And maybe I ought to, let's talk for 2 hours. I just said, I'm sorry. I will not include things in my curriculum that are not published or reviewed or peer reviewed. I said, that's just a long email from you to me. And he did not like hearing that. And I think that's the other thing. Hillary, to go back to your question about advice, all of you here who are going to be experts one day, Margaret, you're going to be a doctor one day, you're just going to have to take the risk of offending people. You cannot live your life, particularly as an expert, because expertise is by its nature exclusionary. You are going to have to risk offending people on occasion and to say, you are simply wrong about this. I tell the story of Sully, everybody knows Sully Sullenberger, right? The guy who lands the airplane on the Hudson River. When airplanes take off, the co-pilot is flying the plane. That's how co-pilots become pilots, is they get all this experience and the pilot sits there. When they hit the birds, Sully said, my aircraft, and he grabbed the stick. That was it on the tape. My aircraft, grab the stick. He didn't say, now look, I don't want to denigrate your piloting skills, and maybe we should talk to some of the passengers, and I think we should have a meeting about this. The more experienced expert in the cockpit said, emergency situation, my aircraft, I'm flying the airplane, that's it. And sometimes you just have to do that. And people don't like it, but I think you can personalize it to them to say, David, risk offending people is not a great title for my next book. My next book has an even more offensive title called Our Own Worst Enemy, which ought to aggravate people even more. You have to, as an expert, you can personalize this to other people and say, if you're an accountant and I'm telling you how to structure, mortgage to buy a restaurant for a commercial property, should people listen to me or you? And people will get it, but they're not going to like it. Shreya, your point about social media, that's also my point on social media. On Facebook and on Twitter, I am Dr. Buzzkill. I'm the guy that pops in and says, yes, that's a fascinating story. It's a great factoid. It's an urban legend and it's wrong. And I don't care how fun you think it is. It's just wrong.
Dr. Nichols, there was a quote from Norm Macdonald that I always remember, is that
a great philosopher of Canada.
So anybody who doesn't know Norm Macdonald, he's a comedian. but he said that nobody likes the smartest guy in the room. And the fact that so much of a lot of the political media that a lot of young people have today is just comedy shows, basically.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, since our group is about communicating with people who are, not experts on the subject, and comedy is kind of a way to get through to people, and that's essentially what they're trying to do. What is your opinion about that?
I think humor is the greatest thing in the world, especially for disarming people who are coming into a discussion, fired up for a fight. And I think it's really important. And I think a good, graceful, this goes back to Max's question and to some extent what Margaret was asking, humor can be a really graceful and humanizing thing to do, especially a certain amount of self-deprecating humor. One time I was in a discussion like this in a panel, and someone said, "Well, Professor," and I said it that way, and I said, "Hey, I didn't call you any names," and everybody kind of stopped, and we all got it right that Professor was being used like pedophile, bank robber, and I said, "Okay, I get it. We can laugh about this." But my one concern about this among younger generations of folks who've been raised on this is the unseriousness that sometimes comes with treating everything as a hip, postmodern, ironic joke. That everything is kind of a hip joke that we already assume that we're all in on it. We're all kind of chuckling and rolling our eyes when half of us may not even get it. And I love dry humor. Norm Macdonald, I actually went to see Norm Macdonald in person, live, for a stand-up because I love Norm Macdonald's dry humor so much. But there comes a time when you have to step back and say, not everything is a postmodern kind of droll dismissal. Not everything is amenable to Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert's approach. And so I think knowing when to be funny, knowing when to deploy that humor in a tense situation with people who have a problem with expertise, is really important. I mean, it's been a thing for years of people tell you to begin a lecture to soften up the audience with a joke. I'm not sure that works, but I think it's also important to be stoic and resilient and to be able to smile and to have a thick skin. Because the one place a lot of experts go wrong is that they clam up and they get tense and they get defensive and they're like, well, fine, if you don't want to hear from me, I'll just talk to other doctors. Your job is to go out there and engage the public and understand that it's not going to be fun. A certain amount of good humor and taking yourself not too seriously when you do that can help. But treating everything as ironic, that gets on my nerves.
Jack, you had a question about the two-party system, if you want to ask that real quick.
Oh, I saw that. Yeah, I saw that in the chat about, sorry, go ahead, Jack. I thought I was reading your, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the two-party system, I actually am a fan of party systems because as a political scientist, one of the things I would tell you as an expert is that parties, actually, the two-party system makes people aggregate their interests. For years, the two-party system was actually a moderating influence because you couldn't get everything you wanted. I mean, as opposed to a parliamentary system where there's 100 parties, right? You say, well, I'm from Rhode Island and I am all about, everybody eating clams. So I am from the Parliamentary Rhode Island Clam Eating Party. Well, that's not how, if that's what you're about, then you have to talk in this system. You have to talk to the Republicans or the Democrats to say, hey, I'll trade with you. You trade with me. Maybe you get people to eat more clams, come to Rhode Island for tourism. I'll subsidize corn in Iowa. The problem is that the parties now are just tribal flags that don't mean anything. They're just team colors. It's like the people say, well, I'm a gigantic Boston Red Sox fan. Well, Okay, and then when those players play for the California Angels, do you hate them? No, because it's the Red Sox. I don't care. I don't care who's in it. I'm just for flying that flag. And that's what's happened over the years. We have tons of studies that indicate that the American voter is completely ideologically incoherent. The people who say, well, I'm a conservative, they have no idea what that. If you're a conservative who voted for Donald Trump being anti-immigration, protectionist, and gigantic deficits, then you're not I mean, Donald Trump's trade policy is where left-wing Democrats were in 1988. And I tell them, like, on trade, Donald Trump is indistinguishable from Tom Harkin in 1988 in Iowa. You know, or if you're, you know, a Democrat who is like, well, you know, we have to take a kind of neoliberal pro-business approach, and unions aren't really helping. You know, the Democratic Party is not really a pro-union party anymore. What it is people say, well, I'm basically, my identity is that I am coastal or female or a person of color. You know, as opposed to I'm rural, I'm white, I am male, and they look around for the labels that go on it. I actually think the parties, this is another counterintuitive answer, Jack. The parties need to be stronger. The parties actually need to be able to say, I argued for this in 2016. I said the Republican Party should turn to Donald Trump and say, the Republican Party stands for certain things. You cannot be in this party. You cannot come to our debates. We will not run ads for you. We will not contribute money. You are not welcome on our stage. That's exactly what they did to David Duke in 1991, when Duke, this Klansman, was running for governor. And like, you had Republicans saying, vote for the Democrat. But parties now, people treat them as flags of convenience. They don't have any ideological meaning. So I would like to see party structures become stronger and impose purity tests on their own members to say, you know, if you think NATO sucks, you're not a Republican. You know, if you think unions are bad, you're not a Democrat. You know, the parties are private organizations that have a right to do this, which people forget. Americans think parties are like in the Constitution, like they're public utilities or something. So I don't mind the two-party system. I think it actually, remember that America has the longest continuously functioning written constitution in the world. I think we've been doing okay with it, but the problem is us. The problem is with us as voters, not with the parties themselves. The parties need to actually be stronger.
Well, I think we'll wrap up here. I think we've gone to our time limit. I just want to thank you, Dr. Nichols, for coming and for
pleasure.
everybody's
Thanks
questions.
for having me.
It was great. I had a fun time.
Yeah, that was awesome. And you are hilarious. You do that whole humor thing. So that was much appreciated.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
So if
All right,
anybody,
well,
oh, sorry.
I'll head out and leave you to your meeting, but unless you have any other questions for me.
If anyone wants to check out Dr. Nichols's book, I put it in the chat if you want to click that link, and keep an eye out for his new book that he said will be coming out later. So thank you so much again. That was fabulous.
You're more than welcome.
Thank
Take
you.
care,
Happy
everybody.
holidays.
Bye-bye.
See you all in 2021. Woo!
Better year, one can only hope.
Oh, yeah.
Fingers crossed. Thank you guys so much for joining this call, and I hope you guys really enjoyed the discourse that we had with Dr. Nichols. And like we said before, we have some really awesome plans coming up for next year. Hopefully we get a chance to be in person. Who knows if that'll even happen, but if not, we do have plans for virtual sessions and workshops and getting to talk with senators and lawmakers. So please, please, please keep an eye out for our stuff coming up in 2021. And I hope you guys have a wonderful holiday break.
Make sure to follow us on Instagram.
Thanks for setting this up.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.